Hey guys, so we've had several weekends worth of events now post Rage of the Abyss, so as usual I wanted to provide a tier list focusing on the best rogue decks for the current format, using data from topping information from YCS and regional level events, as well as some Dueling Book data as well. And as always, definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies. You can find all that information in the description below. And also a shout out as always to Renren from YGOProduct.com as well as Ivan for keeping up with all of the meta relevant tops. Anyway, so this was the overall meta tier list that I brought last week, so definitely for this video we're only going to be focusing on decks that are not in tier 1 or 2. So for the rogue tier list for this month, we're actually starting off with Exodia. So this of course topped the YCS Niagara, shout out to Oliver again, but it actually topped a couple more regional level events since then. So you know what, it's not a complete fluke. Definitely anytime I've played against this deck, I actually think it's pretty cool slash funny, just in terms of how the deck has kind of evolved, I guess. You know, before it used to be just straight up just trying to draw as many cards as possible to draw into the 5 pieces. Now it's a little bit different. Obviously, you know, playing against through like Shifter and Secret Village still isn't fun, but at least it's a much different style of gameplay. This thing is pretty funny too. You know, you could get Shifter. This guy might even gain up to 8,000 attack and just like one-shot you as well. And also, as mentioned, Secret Village is pretty strong, and all the pieces are spellcasters as well. One thing though is only one of the lists seemed to be playing Fualos as well as Perlia, and that was also in the side. I'm not sure if that partly had to do with like the price factor, of course, in terms of the other lists not playing it, because I think it'd be pretty funny actually to turn 0 draw like 5 pieces of Exodia. Obviously it probably won't happen that often, but it can happen though, which is something. Then we have Sky Striker, as mentioned in my meta tier list. This really makes it, of course, because Fanyu, the legend, topped the YCS Niagara with this one. But you know what, regional level events wise, has not seen any success, and really hasn't seen that much success in a while. It kind of came and went, at least in like the last year, but it's very sporadic. So for the time being, we're still gonna have it in the rogue section. But you know what, realistically, I think as time goes on, we're probably not gonna see that many tops with this deck, even at the regional level, and it will eventually go down. And then you have Plant Link. So this topped the YCS as well, of course, but it also topped regional level. So definitely something that, you know, you do have to keep an eye out on. We always sleep on it, and then it just tops like a really big event. At this point, I'm not really sure how much the deck has evolved. I know that they're usually like all 60 card lists. They've been making use of like the Ragnarika cards. And also I did notice at least one of the lists that topped in the side, it was playing like the Rose Whip stuff, which, you know, honestly, when this deck goes first, I find it incredibly scary and quite difficult to break through. And then you have Memento. We kind of briefly talked about this in the overall tier list as well, how unfortunately it didn't have any YCS success, but actually regional level ones, it's actually been doing pretty well, and I guess it's just really picking up now. Had a bit of a slow start, but you know what, it's a deck that, from my understanding, at least like the pure version, doesn't really hard lose to something like Fualos, which is kind of a nice plus, but obviously it's still kind of hard with Shifter being in the format, and that card just really completely cripples this deck. So then we move on to White Forest. Unfortunately, another one that didn't quite top at YCS Niagara post Rage of the Abyss, but you know what, regional level wise, it's actually been picking it up as well, similar to like Memento. So, you know, give it a little bit of time, and I think it's just picking up where it left off before this format, which was actually doing quite well. Most of the builds that did top were on the runic version, from my understanding. There was one that was also mixed with like Centurion stuff, which isn't exactly new. I mean, Blazing Quasar is a pretty strong card, and as you would have noticed in the overall meta tier list, Centurion has been doing quite well lately. So then you move on to Chimera, which is another one that's seeing pretty good regional success. Didn't top at YCS, but I think it definitely has the potential to be able to top at that level. I kind of always rave about this deck nowadays, especially mixed with like the Fiendsmith stuff. It's very consistent. It always has been, and now it has ability to, you know, with like Diabels, it's just so strong, forcing your opponent to having to set cards first. So it really turns off things like even any kind of quick play removal, which something like Super Poly, something like Droplets, Eclipse even, which have been very popular lately. So I think it's a very strong deck, especially going first, because it already sort of hand loop for 1 anyways. If you try to do a hand trap and they still play through it, then you're just really getting very low on card advantage to start your turn. And then you have Voiceless Voice. This did not top YCS, but it did top UK Open, and that actually was on my channel in terms of deck profile with Sean, so definitely go check that out. A huge thanks to him again for sending that profile. I think this deck has definitely been going up and down lately. You know, when it first came out, obviously it was tier 1 and kind of just brutally fell after Infinite Forbidden came out, and of course Bistro, the play of that was pretty high. Right now it's not as high as Infinite Forbidden format, I want to say, but nonetheless I think it's a very, also I've been seeing some Twitter posts about this being like a really good deck to start out with for beginners. So if you're watching and you're kind of relatively new to the game, you could look at Voiceless Voice. I think it does have a pretty straightforward line of play. I think definitely a good one to start with, kind of similar to how we used to recommend Sword Soul. And then you have Mermail. This is one that recently got some additional buff with the Rage of the Abyss set. I did a deck profile with Griffin, who finished day 2 at YCS Niagara with this deck, and then recently another one with Joshua, who topped the regional with Mermail. So definitely go check those out. It's another one of those decks that's very scary going first, because they typically do hand loop you for like 2 to 3. They set up like Toad, even post side if they're playing that Eclipse spell. Like they can also negate something like Dark Ruler, I guess, or even Super Poly, I believe. So I think it's incredibly strong. If you don't have Droll, you're probably going to lose for the most part. I'm not really a fan of those kind of hand loop decks, but nonetheless, I think it's nice that this deck did get some support, because the last time I saw even at the rogue level kind of competitive, at least online, at the time we didn't really have IRL events anymore, like early pandemic days, you were still seeing this deck, and really completely fell off since then, and now making a bit of a resurgence. I've definitely been going against this on Dueling Book, and I don't play Droll, so yeah, I usually lose if I lose the die roll. So then you have Pearly, this top the YCS, and I was also looking at their deck list. They seem to be really scared of Dominus Impulse, because one of them was actually even main decking their cross out for all the hand traps, but even main decking one Impulse for them to try to negate that, because realistically, at least in terms of the card pool available right now, there's not many cards that can stop that, at least when you're trying to go first. Obviously, Pearly, they cannot play Impulse themselves, at least not going second from hand, because they do have a lot of lights, but you know what, it is definitely a really strong card. I personally, for me, that has been more impactful against me than something like Fuwalos, and really strong, and Pearly at least was able to hang in there. You also have Kesh Chira. It's, a shifter deck, so you would think maybe it's got a place right now in the format, but lately I feel like we haven't seen that many shifter decks actually thrive like we did kind of previously, right? You have something like Flunder, which you'll see a lot later. It really fell down as well. And, something like, let's say, Prosperity is something that, decks like Kesh Chira, Flunder played, that's gone down in consistency, of course, but nonetheless, I think it's still pretty solid, being able to go first or second. But yeah, so far hasn't had too big of a success. So moving on to the next tier, we start with Sprite. The ones at top, most of them were actually on Runic version. One, I believe, was actually Runic Live Twin, and the other was Runic for Hire Sprite. So both variants that we've seen a lot in the past. At one point, Runic for Hire Sprite, or rather Runic Sprite, was a tier 1 deck a couple of years ago. Really feels like a long time ago at this point. The only non-Runic version also played like the Fiendsmith version, but you know what, if you're looking to pick up a deck, another, I think, a pretty easy deck to learn is Sprite as well. You don't have to have the Fiendsmith stuff at all. Definitely, I think, pretty competent. Without it, it can be pretty good going first and second. Has a lot of non-engine space, so it's, I think, a nice little start. Something like Dominus Impulse, though, I did notice none of them played it, which makes sense to me, because in terms of turning off light, I guess that turns off their Zeus play, which, to be fair, I don't think I've seen Zeus being slapped on just by any deck for quite some time, but it also, Impulse prevents you from activating wind effects, which Ninja Shadow Mosquito, that actually is a wind, and for going second OTK strategy, that card is very important, except for like the Runic version of the price, which they typically don't play, just with the lack of extra deck space, but just also lack of battle phase. But some things to consider there. And speaking of Impulse, then we have Mimighoul, which basically Impulse kind of shuts down this deck's main strategy, because they're trying to give you like the earth monsters and then make you flip them and then trigger their effects, but you can't do that if the opponent, for example, played Impulse from their hand, because they can no longer activate earth effects. So I'm not really sure about the timing with like, the support and the release even of Mimighoul and Impulse at the same time, which is too bad. I thought this deck and its kind of gimmick was really fun and kind of pretty interesting as well. So hopefully this deck, I do think it can probably thrive at a future time. I think Impulse is just such a crazy card. I honestly would not be surprised if it gets limited at some point in the future as well. For now, I think it's not the best time for Mimighoul. And then we have Runic Stun. We talked about Runic earlier. Stun, I mean, in general, has been pretty popular in the past year, unfortunately, because it's just a cheap way to kind of stay relevant in the meta and actually honestly do pretty well. I mean, it did not top YCS this time, but leading up, I would say in the last half year, definitely has topped like 1 or 2 times each YCS. So I think it is definitely strong. Not very fun to play against, but you know what, sure, skill drains at 1. You still have a ton of other floodgates around. Synchro Zone used to be a really strong one. I guess now with like Centurion being pretty strong right now, maybe that's not as good depending on the matchup, but still, there's just so many floodgates that are available still. So next you have Branded Despia, which thankfully did get a couple of regional tops so far, but as someone who plays this deck, it's definitely a lot harder nowadays post Rage of the Abyss. Primarily Dominus Impulse, it's just such a strong card, as I've been constantly saying in this video, just because now, it not only stops Branded Fusion, but even other things like, let's say, Alba's Fusion, let's say, I don't know, like even Albion, any of their fusion effects, so just a lot of different things like Branded Red even, and it also negates effects, so it goes through like Branded Loss Protection, for example, so really detrimental Memento, now you can ash something that's not Brand New Fusion, and also have, if you also have Impulse, and just kind of stop Brand New Fusion as well on top of that. And it's also a trap, which means Thrust is not live, so it really makes it hard to kind of play around. And of course, Fualos, like with the other decks, can also pretty hinder this deck as well. So, you know, not in the best spot, but I would say it still does have potential to get some regional level tops for sure. So then we have Goblin Biker, which I believe has not topped in about 5 months, but you know what, we happen to have 2 regional tops with this deck, post Rage of the Abyss, so pretty interesting. I'm obviously not that familiar with this deck. I know it kind of has like a rank 3 spam to it. I noticed Gossip Shadow in the Extra, which is something we haven't seen since like Rongo Bongo days, really. I think it's pretty interesting. One of the lists that topped was also playing like the Ken and Jen stuff, which turns out they're level 3s, and I guess so they can do some hand loops there as well. So you know what, pretty interesting choice, and I'm sure there will be some direct support for this deck sometime in the future. And then you have Salamangreat. So this has a couple regional tops as well. Post Rage of the Abyss. One made day 2 at YCS Niagara as well, which I also did a profile with Will. You can definitely go check that out. My understanding is they do still struggle with like the Molcharmies that are out. But you know what? They do have something like Abyss Dweller Baguska, which is pretty strong in most formats as well. And they also happen to have like a counter trap and a trap that pops a bunch of stuff as well. So I think it's as a rogue choice at least pretty solid, especially with the amount of non-engine space that it is able to use. So then you have Vanadium, which actually did get a couple of regional level tops so far in this format. I do think that this deck's power level really noticeably has come down since some of the generic brands, like let's say Barone. And of course now some of the builds used to also do like the whole Calamity thing. Not many, but they did have that option available, especially with the counter trap available. That's kind of gone. I noticed that the rank 10 really is something like Cheng Ying, which is obviously a big step down from something like Barone. So I think, you know, Droll is sort of comes and goes, and when in a format where there's not much Droll, Vanadium can at least have a chance, but I would say it definitely has fallen off a lot since its Clore days. And then you have Flunder, which I kind of talked about briefly when I was talking about something like Hashira. It really has fallen quite a bit, even though it is a shifter deck and usually like the best shifter deck. But with hits something like Prosperity, and this deck is kind of known to have consistency issues, I noticed that they have moved towards playing like something like Extravagance, which, you know, really isn't quite the same, doesn't have that same feel to it. So definitely kind of struggling there in terms of representation. So then we move on to Drytron, which actually did get direct support in Infinite Forbidden, but it quickly got forgotten because, you know, everyone was so preoccupied with something like the Fiendsmith cards, for example. But you know what? It did get some regional tops even after that, and now in this new format as well. One of them was actually main decking Secret Village, which I'm assuming, I don't know if they just like summon Anima as part of their end board. I guess that works. I mean, you know what? Secret Village is kind of strong, especially in a deck or in a format where we're obviously playing a lot of spells usually. So Drytron, when it goes first, really strong. While Eva did come back, I don't think they really go with that route anymore from my understanding, because that used to be pretty toxic with like Herald of Orange and, you know, kind of looping back with Leva. But so I think they've moved away from that, especially with like new Drytron support. But you know what? Still pretty cool that this rogue deck is hanging on. And finally, we have Hero. So this did get a regional top as well. I'm sure some of you may have seen it floating around Twitter, because I noticed how it was like a 60 card list, playing like some vanilla monsters like Clayman, because it turns out with like the Primite stuff, they can kind of utilize that to either make like, let's say Baguska, for example, and when you're hit with Shifter, and there's just some other kind of like an Omni Negate available as well through like the Primite cards, turns out. So definitely go check out that profile with Jeremy. Is a fellow Canadian actually, so really cool to see. And Hero, usually pretty popular online as well, and as like a rogue choice, really one of the more long lasting and, you know what, pretty competitively viable deck for quite some time. Alright guys, so that was it for the Rogue tier list by the data for this month post Rage of the Abyss. Hopefully you found that interesting, and hopefully it helps you in terms of making a decision on your next Rogue choice, if that is sort of your thing. So anyways, big thanks to all of you for watching, big thanks to my patrons and sponsors for the continued support, and well, take care guys.